Hi everybody, Professor Olson here to talk about the Roman Empire. We had just finished up with the Republic. I know there's a lot of information coming at you really fast. I hope these videos help to break it down and give you the most important parts for an overview. Again, if you need the PowerPoints, please check the documents and resources area and you will find them. Because I know I go a little fast sometimes, but that's just to give you the overview and the highlights. All right, so shall we dive in? All right, so as we talked about last time, the Republic underwent a shift to empire. And our first emperor, from history's point of view, did not actually call himself emperor. And we're going to see how this all plays out with the help of the military. All right, so unfortunately, we will not have a lot of time to address the Han and the Roman empires, but very quickly, the Han Empire in China was roughly the same size or a little bit bigger than the Roman Empire. Like the Roman Empire, they had a very efficient bureaucracy. They also had a lot of trade goods, and there was some commerce between the two areas because of the beginnings of the so-called Silk Road, which will be 6,000 miles of road and waterways that will connect a large portion of Asia and Europe. At this point, though, there's not a lot of commerce, anything besides commerce. There's not a lot of diplomacy because, of course, there's a language barrier and there was such a physical gap between the two areas. So all of this is making it difficult for the Han and the Romans to communicate as effectively, perhaps, as they could have. It might have been interesting to see if they could have formed an alliance of some sort. But to go into more detail with the Roman Empire, we do need to look at this. Now, princeps in the Latin literally means first citizen. All right, and of course you can see princeps, you immediately see the word prince from, the English, but princeps means the first citizen. As I said, historically he is the first emperor, but Julius Caesar was assassinated because people were fearful he was going to usurp power and take over and become king. Octavian, who was Caesar's adopted son, had learned from his adopted father's error, and he did not want to die as well. So instead of calling himself emperor, he calls himself first citizen. It's a nice innocuous title. It plays up his civic duties. So it's a really smart way for him to assume power and yet make it look like he's not actually doing the thing the Romans fear. All right, so princeps, that was his main title. Now, the Senate gives him a new title. Instead of being Octavian, they say he's Augustus, or the Great One. But the problem is what the Senate may or may not realize at this point is they are becoming more and more obsolete as the centuries will go by. So this is the beginning of the end for them as far as assuming power and control. So with that in mind, now we have to examine how Augustus changes everything, because eventually Octavian in a way is no more and it's just Augustus. All right, we call this period the Principate because of princeps, because of his title. All right, so with that in mind, all right, think about how the military is going to play a large role here. There is going to be more expansion under Augustus. More and more of these retired soldiers, because the latifundia are, of course, within the peninsula, and they're starting to move into the provinces to expand the empire. Now a lot of our retired soldiers will have small farms, but they will be more located in the provinces. So we will have these colonies of former soldiers and their descendants who will begin to populate the empire farther afield. All right. And with them comes, much like the Hellenistic culture, with them comes the Roman culture. So they have some of the roots of Hellenism, and then they have their own unique culture. So what's going to happen is every town they go to, they're going to try to turn it into a mini Rome. They're going to have a forum area where people, mostly men, can gather and talk business, address the politics, address governing issues. They're going to have an amphitheater where they will hold plays and games in order to, again, transmit that Roman culture. They're going to have roads. You might have heard the old saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, there will be a great road network that will help to link the provinces with the empire, with Rome back in Italy proper. So all of this begins to Romanize the provinces, as well as, of course, spreading culture further. All right. So as we move into this, we see more and more as Octavian, now Augustus, shifts into gear. He is now going to start to basically take over. And even though the Senate has, some say, they become basically a mouthpiece. Augustus is king. He is a monarch. This is now a monarchy with him firmly in control, even though he's giving lip service to the Senate and letting them make certain decisions and abiding by the decisions that align with his interests. So this is really the beginning of the end for the Senate. And in the years to come, they'll basically be devoid of power. It'll mostly be a status symbol role. All right. And Augustus continues to spread out. So they've now taken over Egypt, you might remember. Cleopatra and Mark Antony were seen as plotting. Egypt was taken over. Spain had been taken over. Now Augustus and the army begins to look north, toward Gaul, toward Britain, toward what will become Germany. And unfortunately for Augustus's plans, the way that the Germanic tribes fight is more like guerrilla warfare. They fade in and out of the trees, they fight single combat, but the Roman way of war is they march in phalanxes and turtles, and they need plains, flat ground in order to do that. And since most of the Latian plain and the peninsula had been fairly flat, that strategy worked. But now, as they move into what will become Germany, they are defeated utterly at the Teutoburg Forest. Varus was in charge. It was said that Augustus used to literally beat his head against walls and say, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions," because so many men were slain, and it really did cripple parts of the military. So Roman expansion could not go past those forests. Even today, they're still finding remnants of the Roman army that passed through there. The fortunate ones were killed quickly in battle. Some were taken and sacrificed later to their nature gods, the Germanic tribes' nature gods. All right. So, and then of course in Britain, similar circumstances applied. A lot of the Britannic tribes did not want to be taken over and fought, and eventually, by the time the Romans have the bit of Roman Britain that they have, they literally have to build a wall to contain what they've won. All right. So just some things to think about. All right. When we discuss Romanization, to back up, we mentioned that they built the amphitheater. They built the forum. They also brought baths with them because the Romans wanted their baths. And as I mentioned earlier, Bath, England is actually a great example of a Roman bath that's still well preserved. All right. So Romanization helps to unite the provinces with the main part of the Italian peninsula. All right. And of course, it doesn't all come at once. It comes in fits and starts and spurts, and each province engages with Romanization to a greater or lesser degree. It's not a blanket policy. It's not a blanket movement. All right, so just something to keep in mind. Depending on where you are, you may or may not be more Romanized. All right, just some things to think about. All right, and going forward, we see a burgeoning middle class. All right, so it's actually, for some people, Augustus's reign has become a really good thing. All right, it was said that his biggest boast was he saw a city of wood and left it in brick and left it a city of marble. All right, everything he does is to make things look better. All right, remember, Rome at its height had 1 million people. There were a lot of eyes that were going to be looking at these buildings, and they were all to show the state's power. All right, and of course, by forming a standing army and returning the loyalty oath from the general, remember Gaius Marius, back to the empire, or in this case, Rome, because it's not, quote, an empire yet, it's a principate. All right, he's now got people who are loyal to him across the empire. And also, by having a standing professional army, they're not bound by seasonal warfare where they have to go home and take care of crops. They can be a professional army all year round. The other thing that comes into play and will continue to be built upon after Augustus is gone and his successors continue is an amazing administrative machine. Remember how Alexander left behind, thanks to the Persians, a fairly, well organized, massive bureaucracy? Rome will rival that. All right. And of course, Augustus is in charge of appointing all these new governors to provinces and legates who are like, diplomats, and he can recall them at will. All right. But there's a lot of bureaucracy that keeps this machine running. Now, Augustus knew he couldn't move quickly. He had to move slowly. He had to take it in a way that made it acceptable to the other patricians, remember, the upper class? Because if he didn't, there was a very good chance he would wind up like his adopted father, slain on the Senate floor. All right. So he threw himself into this civic campaign. He wanted Roman religion to be reformed. He wanted to strengthen the priesthoods. And he also created a new imperial cult. Now, what we mean by that is the deification of emperors. All right. The deification of emperors was they literally would raise up people who had served as rulers to be gods. Now, at the time, there were no emperors, all right? But what he does is he raises up his slain adopted father, Julius Caesar, to godhood. And then, of course, upon his death, Augustus would receive the same honor. In fact, one of my favorite stories is Severus, one of the emperors, upon his deathbed as he lay dying, said, "Dear me, I'm becoming a god." All right, I thought that was a great story and a great way to illustrate that. So just to keep these things in mind, he also launches a campaign for morality. And a lot of people fell afoul of this. Not everybody wanted to be reformed. For example, Ovid, who wrote some lovely poetry, also wrote a book about how basically to pick up women. And his so-called Art of Love scandalized Augustus, so he actually exiled Ovid, and Ovid spent the rest of his life trying to return to Rome. He also ordered his daughter exiled for committing adultery. All right. So Augustus really believed in morality. In addition, under his reign, Virgil would go to write the Aeneid. I mentioned that earlier about tying the origin story of Rome to the Trojan War and giving them a Greek origin backstory. Virgil writes this in part to help further the national origin story. All right, and of course, it's a pure myth. Livy would write some histories of Rome that would become very popular, of course, very stirring, and a number of poetry and, works of poetry and plays were written. Comedy, again, very popular. All right. Augustus's reign was seen as a Roman golden age. All right. And to people who came in later, this was looked back as one of the prime times to be alive as a Roman. All right. Now, At first, when the torch is passed, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, because it goes from Julius Caesar, since, I'm sorry, I should say actually Augustus, but since he's related to Julius Caesar through adoption, we call this the Julio-Claudian because Claudius will be the last part of this line. The successors at first were well liked. Later, however, they are not so well liked, and they actually overreach, and they actually lose and are replaced by other dynasties. All right, but at first, Rome becomes moral because of Augustus. In addition, we have a new middle class. We have the equestrian order. So we start to see a new middle class, which of course shows that the economy is improving. So the so-called equestrian class is a highly motivated group who wish to further themselves, so they become more literate. They actually become more wealthy. They're not as wealthy as the patricians, but again, a middle class is a sign of a healthy society. So Rome has clearly come further, much further since it started as a trading post. All right, so these are some things just to keep in mind. All right, now going forward, we see Nero. If we want to talk about some Roman emperors who really were characters, Nero wanted to be an artist and a poet and a musician. And he was actually put into this position because his mother poisoned his father, Claudius. And it was said that he used to go out dressed as a commoner, and he would actually rough people up at night before he became emperor. He eventually committed suicide. Caligula was another character, if you will. He was very much against keeping the Augustan morals. It was said that he performed a number of acts against people of a more sexual nature. All right, and he also attacked the pretense that the Senate had authority, so of course he also had to go. A lot of the senators took umbrage and were offended. All right, now the Flavian dynasty will become the first to use the term emperor openly. All right, they come from military stock, they have military training, and of course, most of our emperors that we will see throughout this period are military men. All right, they are able to make military decisions. They understand how their backbone of the military will think and act and react. All right, and of course, they can't go north into the German forest, so they begin to spread out in other ways. They've pushed into Europe. They are now going down into Palestine and what used to be Mesopotamia, Sumer. All right, a lot of costly wars. In fact, one of the reasons why the Roman Empire won't endure is because of economic issues. It costs a lot of money to wage war, and it costs a lot of money to hold territory. All right. Now, we call these this one period the Five Good Emperors. During this time period, a number of men would hold the emperor position but not leave behind an heir. All right, Hadrian built the wall in Britain that you might remember I mentioned to keep in the Roman winds, to keep the tribes out. All right, and of course, with that in mind, we see that Rome has now reached a natural place where they can't expand any further. All right. And in fact, all of this war and all of these prisoners of war actually drove slave prices down. And it also, surprisingly, though, created some economic upswing. All right, a lot more people were trading because think of how big this empire was. So there were taxes coming in, taxes on boats, on ports, on goods. There were people engaged in more long-term trade. All right, and more people were being born. More and more people were asking for and buying Roman citizenship. because it was offered. You had to fulfill certain obligations, certain duties, and you had to pay a certain price for it. And with this, we see an expansion of the bureaucracy because now there's more and more and more Romans. All right, the Pax Romana, Pax means peace. So the Pax Romana is the peace of Rome, where there's this amazingly peaceful period for a while, and trade expands dramatically. And the problem, though, is more and more of the trade is migrating to the east. To the east, further east, is China. China is willing to trade silk. All the Chinese want is gold and silver. They don't really want anything from the rest of the world at this point. So what happens is more and more money stays east, and more people see the opportunity is to the east, and they migrate east if they can. More and more the West is beginning to feel the pinch of that. And we're going to see that the empire is going to literally split in two, east and west, in part because of this. All right, so just some things to keep in mind as we go through. All right, the last of these good emperors during the Pax Romana is Marcus Aurelius, who's going to be the only one to produce a son as well, which is, of course, going to end this period of good emperors. Marcus Aurelius was a big Stoic philosopher. He really embraced that doctrine of Stoicism that I mentioned in chapter 5. All right. His son, however, did not share his enthusiasm. So while Marcus Aurelius was writing Meditations, which is still a major Stoic text, his son Commodus had other interests. He dressed as a gladiator. He saw himself as the reincarnation of Heracles. You may know him as Hercules from the Greek. And he really was despised because he, by dressing as a gladiator, by actually fighting with gladiators in the arena, to the Roman people, he had cheapened himself and he had degraded himself because he was actually acting more like a slave, not like an emperor. All right, and of course that's going to be a problem because of course Commodus is going to be murdered so that someone to the Romans who is more suitable can be put in place. All right, so just some things to think about. Okay, moving forward. The Roman Empire at its height covers millions and millions of square miles. All right, but it has issues. There's a security problem. There's too much frontier to defend. That's why Hadrian built a wall in Britain. But of course, how can you build a wall in every region you're in? You're in Spain, you're in Italy, you're in Germany. Well, you're not in Germany yet, but you're moving up to the corner of Germany. You're in Egypt, you're in North Africa. You are down in the Middle East, all right? The only prize left really is to go north, and they can't, all right? So how do you defend all this? And more, as young men found other ways to make money, they could be merchants and they could work, with their father doing whatever. And some of them had plenty of money from being in the equestrian class. A lot of them didn't want to go and become soldiers. All right, so too few people for too many borders. All right, so at its height, at one point, the army was seen as a wonderful way to advance your career. But now people begin to leave. They don't want to be in the army. But the army helped to spread Romanization. Army camps turned into new urban centers to increase the empire's reach. But eventually we're going to see a falling away of that. More and more young men don't want to be in the army. All right. And this sort of leads into the medieval period. More and more of these cities will, of course, build walls. They've been building walls for ages now. But they're also going to be building fortresses, which are kind of a precursor in some ways to the palaces and the medieval castles. All right. You're going to be seeing a documentary and writing about it, Roman Roads. I can't emphasize this enough. You've heard the old saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, it's true during this period. But more importantly, if necessary, those armies could march out from Rome. And trust me, if there was a Roman army marching up that road and they were going pretty quick, you scrambled to get out of their way. They were not stopping for you. You had to get out of their way. So you could literally send armies all over Rome. So the roads were very, very important, all right? In the meantime, the cities had a role to play as well. They're exchanging economics via money, commerce, making things. There was one town that only made shoes, for example, all right? And Rome got used to being standardized. Money was standardized. Laws were standardized. Culture became standardized. Romanization progressed. All right. In fact, there were a number of luxury items that were made. Makeup, for example. We also know that there was a lot of entertainment. People would flock to certain places for entertainment, like the gladiator games. But we do know that they were, those who could afford it wanted silk, they wanted other luxury items. All right, and again, the Silk Road connecting to China. India, too. They began to pick up goods from India. But let's talk about the breakdown of society. All right. Your upper 5-10% patrician class probably hold a lot of the wealth. The equestrian class probably holds 10 to 20% of the wealth. And then after that, most people are poor. Remember, subsistence agriculture, you only grow what you need, and then there were the latifundia that they couldn't compete with. All right, most of your Romans are poor. In fact, those sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of soldiers who were retired and moved to the provinces and got their piece of land, a lot of them were poor. And if that wasn't enough, some of them still had to compete with latifundia. There were some latifundia scattered around. In fact, it's believed now that the earliest medieval serfs were actually colony, which were slaves that were literally left in the middle of nowhere to farm a latifundia. And after everything fell apart, were abandoned and were basically slaves to the land because their master had died. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the medieval period. So just so you can see how things were advancing, all right? So, and of course, most of the major cultural shifts, the breakthroughs for literary works and artworks are happening back in the cities because that's where the money is, that's where the elites are living, all right? So when we think about it, a lot of these cities have concrete. Remember I mentioned concrete earlier? Concrete is being used on a massive scale. It helps them to build large buildings quickly, like amphitheaters, where these plays are going on, where gladiator games are going on, all right? So we have Seneca and Tacitus who are writing about Stoic philosophy and history. We have Virgil who's writing the Aeneid. We actually have architects figure out how to create domes and arches. That technology will be lost until about the Renaissance. So there will be a period of hundreds of years where this knowledge will disappear. And the arches actually help to distribute the weight more evenly. So now we have aqueducts, we have better doorways, we have all these things that will for centuries be lost. Nobody will understand how they did it. All right. And as I said, even today, we're just starting to understand why Roman concrete has been so durable. All right. And of course, people need to be entertained. You might remember I mentioned bread and circuses to you last time. People are flocking to the city. They're getting their ration of grain. They need to be entertained. So what they're doing is they're actually finding ways to entertain these people. All right, chariot racing, gladiators. These were originally Etruscan funeral games. Now they're going to be used to control the population. If you're a criminal, you're brought out as entertainment and slain for the good of the crowd. Gladiators were either slaves who'd been captured in battle and it was decided they could still fight, so it would be fun to put them in the ring. You might remember I mentioned earlier, fallen people such as the Samnites became a class of gladiator. Certain gladiators were put on display regularly, for exhibition matches as well as regular matches. Now, when we think of gladiators, we immediately think, oh my gosh, they fought to the death. Actually, they're an investment. This was a big enterprise. Slaves were valuable. At least gladiators were valuable because time had been taken to train them or they had training already. So unless a gladiator was a horrible coward or there was a reason for a fight to the death, they preferred not to do that because it was a waste of money. Gladiator games were big business. You might remember I mentioned the Aediles who organized the games. This is like the NFL of the ancient world, all right? This is like the National Football League who make billions of dollars, all right? This was an investment. This was important, and this was a lot of money on the line, or should I say denarii, all right? So this is not something that they're going to take lightly. Same thing with chariot racing, a lot of money on the line, and people bet. People bet so many different, big bets on these things. And in fact, a way to control the population was the gladiators served as a cautionary tale. You didn't want to wind up like them. You didn't want to wind up like the criminals who were executed for the entertainment of the crowd. In addition, gladiator game goers could expect that there would be little prizes given out. Sometimes they would throw money out into the crowd. Sometimes they would throw little wooden balls out. When you broke them open, there could be anything in there. In fact, it was said that at one game, I believe several houses were given away, horses were given away. So you went to the games hoping that you were going to get something that was going to make your immediate situation better if you were one of the very poor people. All right. And of course, again, this is the first welfare state. People are literally getting welfare. They are getting enough grain to make their bread for one day. And then they have to go back again and again and again, unless they're fortunate enough to eventually get a job. But again, not very likely. All right. So when we think of the gladiator games, who's putting up the money? The government. The government is putting up the money. If you go and look at the Colosseum or the Colosseum today, you will see, when it's also called the Flavian Amphitheater, because the Flavians, the ones who first used the title emperor openly, in a way bought their approval by putting up the amphitheater. Because the Colosseum, if you look at it, you can find many, many diagrams online. It's got lifts to bring animals up for hunts, the venatio, or bring gladiators up to the arena. They've got all sorts of cells and other things to contain people, but 9 times out of 10, the gladiators didn't stay long. Once their game was done, they were probably leaving out the back door at the bottom to go and be brought back to wherever it was they had come from. So it was a big enterprise. So again, a lot of money on the line, a lot of denarii on the line. All right, so just some things to think about. All right, and if you are one of these poor people, well, how do you deal with your life? You're probably going to be looking at religion. All right. Fortunately, because of old gladiator games, medicine actually improved. Physicians like Galen were studying wounds and seeing how to apply that to everybody. So medicine actually got better. Plus, we had all those Hellenistic breakthroughs where it was physical ailments rather than divine ones. Also, slavery is still widespread, but it's getting diversified. There's a lot of slaves working in the imperial bureaucracy, helping out all those bureaucrats. There are slaves in the latifundia. They're doing things as strange as vine, viniculture. They're actually cultivating vines, or they're actually herding chickens. There is actually a list, you can find it in Kenneth Bradley's book, I believe, with all the different jobs that slaves had. And they had some very, very strange titles. All right, so, and of course, not much has changed. Men are still the heads of households. Women are rarely able to participate in political life. But if you're of the upper class, you have more options, of course. And in turn, we're also going to see a gender imbalance. More and more women will be disappearing because it costs so much to get a dowry together. A lot of the poorer people literally sell their daughters off into slavery or to a brothel because they cannot afford the marriage, which of course is going to create later on a gender imbalance. But not among the upper classes, of course, because they can afford the dowry and women have more options. So just some things to think about. A lot of political instability. All right, Commodus's assassination, and of course, economic unrest. We're going to see more and more economic problems. Remember the high cost of defending empire. All right, and in fact, people actually devalued the currency. Enterprising people would take out the silver or gold in the middle of a coin. They take out that section, and then they would put like cheap metal, like lead or something in it, and then they would cover it up by melting gold or silver and putting it back over the coin to make it look like it was whole. In fact, even in America, we had similar problems. If you ever look at a quarter or dime, they have that so-called reeded edge where it's got the little lines cut into it. Because in the older days, people were literally, when our coins were made out of silver, they were shaving off the silver on the edge and then melting that and making that into wealth for themselves. So we have this problem in Rome where they're devaluing the currency. And of course, the currency and the economy will suffer some collapse. There will be higher inflation during the Roman period. And a lot of people were upset and worried, and they turned to religion to make themselves feel better. Now, you might remember I mentioned Isis and Ra, the power couple of Egypt, and how Isis brings him back from the dead. Well, the cult of Isis will actually have a temple in Rome. And of course, women will flock there, but some men will too. All right, so Isis was a very important person for women as far as religion goes. All right, but let's talk for a moment about Judaism. All right, Judaism has been going along relatively the same. Some have fallen into the Hellenistic culture and they have become, drifting away from their original faith. Others became more Judaic and actually wanted to mount a rebellion to remain pure and to remain apart. All right. Now, the Jewish revolt against Rome will end in a number of bloody wars, with the Maccabees leading a revolt. And of course, sadly, the Jews will fall and those who survive will become slaves. All right. Now, it became so bad for the Jews, some of them actually committed suicide rather than be taken into slavery. Now, there's an outshoot from Judaism. It's called Christianity. All right. So this gives rise to a new religion. All right. So we have the cult of Isis, mystery cult. Followers have an ecstatic religious experience. It's believed some drugs might have been involved. Highly sought after as a more woman-centered religion. All right. For the men, especially soldiers, we have the cult of Mithras, a soldier god. If you wonder why we celebrate Christmas on December 25th, wonder no longer. It's actually Mithras's birthday. And when Christianity became prominent, it fused with that date. Even though if you read the New Testament account, Jesus was born in the spring. So this is why Christmas is celebrated on December 25th, because it's Mithras's birthday. All right. Christianity, again, is an outgrowth of Judaism, and Jesus was crucified as a state criminal and blasphemer because he dared to call himself the Son of God, and the Jewish people became extremely offended. Crucifixion was saved for traitors, for criminals against the state. It was not a punishment to be undertaken lightly, and it was to serve a certain purpose. But Christianity, with its message of a life after death, with having a personal relationship with Jesus who would walk the earth, actually sparked a lot of new followers. All right. And in fact, the cult of Isis and the cult of Mithras gave way in a way to Christianity because, like them, it proposed a more intimate connection to the object of your worship, to the person or the God you were worshiping. All right. And of course, Jesus's values were seen as worthy because a lot of people, slaves, the poor, felt they had been ostracized and frozen out by the elites. They were poor. They were living hand to mouth. And with the idea of charity, giving, and helping others, with being brothers, true brotherly love, Christianity also promised a better life after. And it was very attractive, especially to the poor and to the slaves within the community. And humility, charity, and brotherly love really spoke to these groups, all right? Especially because more bad news is on the horizon, all right? And in fact, it's possible the myth of the vampire was caused by Christianity, because when the early Roman officials, the Roman officials during the early days of Christianity first heard of the religion, they heard about eating the body and drinking the blood. They thought these people were cannibals. They were scandalized and they were determined to stamp out this horrible new belief because they really believed that these people were eating bodies. All right. And of course, since they only had one God, Isis, Mithras, Christianity, Judaism, they were seen as wrong because everybody else was polytheistic. All right. So all of these things combine to actually create a religious fear among the Romans. They actually had people swear a loyalty oath. It was kind of like the old American Express commercials, don't leave home without it. They gave you a certificate of loyalty. You had to bring a pinch of incense in to one of the major Roman temples and put it on the altar and swear loyalty to the Roman gods and the Roman religion, including the goddess Roma, who was the patron goddess of the city of Rome. And if you didn't, and it was found out, you could be arrested. All right. So clearly they really saw this idea of one deity as a threat, regardless of which religion was practiced. All right. When we look at early Christianity, Jesus was the Messiah if you go through biblical prophecies in the Old Testament. A lot of people have looked through this. You can find studies if you're interested. It said he fulfilled, I believe it was 109 prophecies. All right. However, because he dared to call himself the Son of God and because he didn't free the Jews from Roman oppression, a lot of the Jewish people said, well, he can't be the Messiah because if he was the Messiah, he would have come and freed us. And of course, instead, the Jews continued to labor under Rome. And then, of course, he was executed and, his followers say he's resurrected. We're not going to get into religious argument. We're just stating the historical record and what we see. All right. And those who receive him get salvation. Because the religion at the time wasn't really written down but orally transmitted, a lot of people would set up in house churches. They would wait for letters to arrive. A lot of the early gospels and epistles from Paul and other apostles were copied down and handed around. And it took a long time before it became a codified religion. All right. So at first, it is spreading like wildfire, but it's probably a lot different than the Christianity that is now prevalent in the world because they didn't have all of the written texts. Like Judaism, the Jewish people are people of the book. The Christians will adopt and continue that philosophy going forward. All right. Paul, of course, is one of the major proponents of spreading the gospel, also of setting up church administration via his epistles. And also, the 12 apostles didn't all write everything down either. They weren't all literate either. But Paul will have sent copies of his letters to people. Other people will copy them, and he does help to be a major figure after Jesus in organizing the church. All right, so just some things to keep in mind. The Romans did not like Christianity at first. It would be many, many years before they make this legitimate and legal. All right. But for a long time, it was popular, but it had to remain underground. All right. And there were purges and there were persecutions. And I'm not going to get into too many of that and too many things on that here because I know we only have so much time. But, you know, I do want to emphasize again that Christianity will not be legal until the 300s. All right. And unfortunately, while Rome is enduring growing pains with this new religion, and it's also having shrinking pains because the entire infrastructure is beginning to show cracks. During the terrible 3rd century, we start to see more and more inflation. We start to see more and more civil wars break out. The provinces are not so united. And we also see a series of natural disasters. Some emperors felt that that meant that they should pray harder to their gods. They believed their gods were angry with them. Of course, Christians took it as a sign that everybody should turn Christian. The Jews took it as a sign everybody should follow Judaism. So there was a lot of concern about divine intervention during this period. The one thing that they didn't have to worry about was they had the sovereign rulers who were military people. Military machinery was still humming along. The generals and the emperor were still in charge. They knew what was going on militarily. But the terrible 3rd century was terrible. Food prices went up. Crop production went down. The economy destabilized with inflation, runaway inflation, rampant inflation. It was a very scary time to be alive for the Romans. All right, I know we've done a lot of ground, but I just want to give you again an overview. All right, and of course, here's Hadrian, who built our wall in Britain. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son. As you can see, he's picturing himself as a military man. He's picturing himself as a principled citizen, princeps. He's making sure that they're aware of his loyalty to Rome. All right, just some things to think about. And interestingly, Caesar's family claimed descent from gods, Venus and Cupid, which of course then meant that Augustus, aka Octavian, could then raise up his adopted father and say, well, he's divine, he's a god. And of course, statues were built. All right, and Augustus created the Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard. Sometimes over history, the Praetorian Guard could build an emperor up and they could also assassinate him. So it's a very important position. All right, as you can see, we have now reached the pinnacle of Roman civilization. Millions of square miles, millions of people living within the Roman Empire. This is a system that at its time is a superpower. This is a superpower, all right? But notice how many different people groups are contained. They're not all Roman. They're Egyptian. They're North African. They're Mesopotamian. They are Dacian. They are Thracian. They are Spanish. They are Baltics. They are Britannica, you know, they are Britons, they are Germanics, the Germanic tribes. Some of them are hanging around the border and trading for wine and other commodities. And in turn, some of the Romans along those borders are becoming a little more Germanized. They're trading for warmer cloaks and trousers. So it's a really cosmopolitan time. And of course, they're still trading with China via agents through the Silk Road. All right. And of course, military camps turn into cities, help to further that Romanization. All right. Now, all of this is an economic map. As you can see, there are trade routes. There are so many different goods that they're trading for. Olive oil, of course, is a staple. Wine is a staple. Grain is a staple. In fact, they're importing grain to feed the mob. Remember bread and circuses from Egypt and Spain. They're their bread baskets. All right. So clearly, this is a big undertaking. You see why they need a bureaucracy? All right, and of course, there's our Silk Road going through Bactria, where Alexander had met his one wife, going down through Arabia, all right, all the way into China. Hangzhou on the coast there is still a major port today for a lot of goods that ship from China. I know this because I used to be an import-export. All right, so many, 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 many roads lead to Rome. And they're not all just roads, they're waterways as well. All right, so quick shot of the aqueducts. All right, this is the Capitoline, which as you can see has a dome. And of course it celebrates God Jupiter. Remember those domes and arches, aqueducts. All right, again, real estate. This is the place you want to be. The Colosseum, the baths, the palaces. You want to be on one of the hills. You don't want to be living in an insulae somewhere where it could burn down at any given moment. All right, the Colosseum, as you can see, I mean, it's still standing. All of this was to hold animals and machinery and bring them up to the arena floor for the entertainment of the crowd. And we could spend all day on that, but we won't. All right, so just if you're interested, I highly recommend you check out some books. Might be some documentaries that I'm not aware of right now. I know there's always new information coming to light. There is, if you're interested in gladiators, they did unearth a gladiator school recently in Austria. They haven't unearthed it all yet, but they've used ground penetrating radar. They've got some preliminary photographs. They're slowly excavating it carefully so as to preserve it as best as possible. So if you do a search, I'm sure you can find more information because I know a lot of people are fascinated by gladiators. All right. So, and as you can see, this is an Egyptian family who has actually become more Romanized. So you can see that fusion of cultures, much like the Hellenization. All right. And of course, the frescoes. And here's our timeline. All right, so I hope this video has been helpful. And if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Office hours again, Tuesday, Thursdays. So, all right, have a great day, a great week, and I'll see you again soon for Chapter 7. Take care.